People are willing to say, no, I don't want Biden, but I'm going to support the Democrats up for their election. And when Harris comes out, Harris gives everyone a lift. There's a lot of enthusiasm for her. And the leads that these candidates had over their Republican opponents grows. All of a sudden, in the past 3 weeks, the polling has shown that as Kamala's come back in, as Trump has gained in the polling overall, as the betting markets has shifted away from Harris and into the Donald, you're seeing that the Democrats' polling in the swing states is also falling. Effectively, people are imagining that whatever happens to Trump is going to filter through everywhere else.
All you timeless children with your predictions and flashbacks, trying to get ahead. What makes you think I can see you? What makes you think I believe you? Dreams inside my bed. Have you heard me lately? We were stepping up wailing. Shot, that's from the past. All the dreams were flying, all the thoughts were dying. Heard, it's from the past.
This is the Prediction Trade. I'm your host, Chris Vecchio, joined by my co-host, Jeff Joseph, on this Thursday, October 17th, 2024. And Jeff, what a time to be alive. There's been a surge in the betting markets.
There has been a surge. So that's something to talk about today. That surge has come out of nowhere and doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of the polling. That's an interesting thing, this kind of deviation that we have going on. So maybe there's an arbitrage opportunity. I think we should go deeper on that today.
We should go deeper on that today. Before we get there, of course, I want to welcome everyone who's watching on YouTube. If this is your first time with us, make sure you like and subscribe. Join the conversation about what's happening in political betting markets, which are now legal here fully in the U.S. Kalshi's contracts are listed on exchanges. You could trade them from some platforms now if you're into finance. Jeff, it's a wonderful development and extension and evolution of these betting markets, of course. But the betting markets are in focus the last 2 days because of the rise in those Trump odds. And boy, have they risen. When we take a look at PolyMarket right now, Trump 60.5% to Harris's 39.5%. Jeff, this isn't a trend that's been happening over the course of a few weeks. These odds have exploded here. In fact, the down ballot drift is so significant that in the past 24 hours, the GOP odds of a House of Representatives victory have increased from 37% to 51%. So Jeff, help me make sense of this, because I'm sure our audience is feeling the same way here, right? What's going on here? What's moving these markets? Is this coming from the polls?
Put this in the context of recent events, as you mentioned, and as we mentioned last week, or the last time we were together, that betting markets are legal right now. Kalshi had a favorable district appellate ruling that basically has opened the door from this point going forward. You're going to see a lot more betting markets emerge, but this is the election season right now. Kalshi was ready at the drop of the hat. They immediately, within an hour of the ruling, added a couple of markets. And now, as we noted today in the weekly Luckbox letter, by the way, it's a free subscription at getluckbox.com. We cover the prediction markets in almost every issue. Yesterday, I reached out to Tarek Mansour. He's the CEO of Kalshi, not only to congratulate him on his recent rise. We've been following. We first covered Kalshi as it emerged 4 or 5 years ago. So we go back in terms of speaking with him and covering the evolution of that platform. But you're right, there's been a surge of betting. He quantified it for us. He said that every day he is taking on 150 to 200% more new accounts than the day before. And that's over the last 2 weeks. So that's, parabolic growth in terms of new people coming to the platform to bet on politics. He expects it to continue. He's obviously very excited about the growth, and he does have an issue at hand. We didn't discuss that, but you and I are going to discuss that now. You brought it to my attention. Obviously, I've been seeing the surge in Trump as the candidate. The context is we have 50-50 markets, right? Today, Nate Silver said it's essentially a 50-50 game. He gave Trump a 0.2% edge in the Electoral College, which was notable because it's the first increase that in the popular vote, it's the first increase he's given Trump ever, the advantage over Harris. But the betting markets are showing something very different. They're showing a 20-cent spread, basically, 60 to 40, both on Kalshi and even more dramatic on PolyMarket. And you're the one who kind of opened up my eyes to what might be going on here. I wasn't following this, but you sent me a link offline about an hour ago about what appears to be some whales that have entered the prediction markets. And you sent me the source of this dialogue on X, and I know Doma. I've had him on as a guest on the podcast 3-4 years ago when we were covering the prediction markets. And he's a heavy hitter. He's a full-time professional political election wagerer. That's what he does. He bets prediction markets. And he noticed this meteoric rise in Trump's odds relative to what the polling markets are showing. Because whether it's 538 or Silver Bulletin or Real Clear Politics, you're basically seeing a 2 to 3 point spread with Harris in the lead for the most part. But on the betting markets, Trump's way out in front. And what he has accounted for in this dialogue on X is what appears to be this is not verified, but this is what he believes to be the case, that a French millionaire has placed $28 million in wagers on Trump being the winner of the presidential race. And that, of course, in still what's a relatively thin market, particularly on call sheet, but PolyMarket is claimed to be host to well over $1 billion in presidential wagers at this point, approaching $2 billion, that has moved the market considerably. And it's a plausible explanation. We just can't say that it's verified. But if you had, and we saw this, you and I both saw this in real time, if you see such a dramatic move over the course of 48 hours, when there's no other real data that would support that, it makes a lot of sense that a whale might be moving the market right now.
This is a story that's also available on Newsweek now, what we know about the mystery whale betting on Trump. It's a story that went live yesterday morning. And it's basically a breakdown of that Twitter thread, which I would recommend everyone go out of their way to read at DOMA 4Hs. I'm not responsible for any of the content contained within the account. I've never read anything else he's tweeted, but I know that this is a big deal because we're having news organizations talk about it as well. It's a fascinating look into this because, Jeff, I think people look at this and say, oh, wow, we're up from, 50-50 to 60-40 in PolyMarket. This is a slam dunk for Trump. Seasoned bettors look at this basically as a money line moving from minus 125 to 150.
That's right.
That's not that significant of a shift here. I'm not trying to calm down maybe Democrat listeners' fears, so to speak. But if this is being done by one person, the odds of this race in terms of the broader polling, less than 3 weeks out, the contours haven't changed all that much, which adds an interesting layer to all of this. For so many weeks and months, we've been talking about the 2024 presidential election almost as this carrot that was dangling in the distance that we were chasing. In effect, it was the long-dated option that you were trading. The vice presidential pick for the Democrats, for the Republicans, who would be the Democrats' nominee, right? Those were all very short, high convexity trades because there was a week to expiry on those events. We're now entering the window with less than 3 weeks left to go here to the presidential election, where these betting markets become a lot more sensitive to the day-to-day shifts in the polls. If you start to see a big swing from one candidate to the other in a Pennsylvania or a Georgia, these top line odds, Trump 60, Kamala 40, could start to move a little bit more aggressively to like a 65-35 or even back into 55-45 without so much as a blink of the eye. So when you see a story about whales and you think about the structure now of the betting market as we close in on the election, is there a takeaway that you have here about how it's informing your positioning?
Sure. It sets up trades. So what you clearly have are arbitrage opportunities, right? You have distinctly different spreads now on the presidential outcome on PolyMarket, which the vast majority of Americans are not going anywhere near that market. It requires an offshore account, a VPN, blockchain wallet, or a crypto wallet. It's a crypto-based exchange. But those odds, but for those who are playing both markets, you play the middle. So you would buy Harris at a cheaper price there. You could sell Trump over on call sheet. There's all sorts of middle opportunities for active political wagers that are playing within both markets whenever you have a distortion of a price. And if we step back a little bit, that's what's attractive about the prediction markets, is that they are, as long as I've been an active trader in those, I've always found them to be inefficient markets. Not like the price of Tesla or the price of Apple, where all the news is baked into the market price. These are efficient markets, as evidenced by the fact that you have such a material distortion between what PolyMarket and Kalshi are quoting as the probability of an outcome and what Nate Silver is quoting as the probability of outcome, who calls this a dead heat and said today that think about this as an NBA game where the score's 110-110 with 3 minutes to go. That's how he expects to see this go for the remaining 2.5 weeks until the election. That it's going to be up 2 points, down 2 points, up 2 points, down 2 points. So Trump is way overvalued on PolyMarket. And if you were an EV, expected value better, you'd be shorting Trump there, expecting some sort of regression to the mean on Kalshi for those markets to get closer, more closely resembling what polling looks like today.
It would appear in the short term there's a little bit of gap closure, at least attempting to be had between PolyMarket and Kalshi, because Kalshi's been, let's say, middle of the road. Predict it's been a little bit more Harris friendly in terms of how the odds have been favoring her. When you look at PolyMarket, it's been a little bit more right leaning for Trump. Okay, Kalshi's been straddling the two of them somewhere dead center, and it's now up to 58% here. It's possible that people are operating in both pools trying to hedge off bets. But I suppose that's the interesting question about why, let's say, a whale would even be motivated to operate in these markets, Jeff. Political betting markets, if you think about their history, they have a history going back to 19th century UK. And what we see from the historical record at the time is that British bettors weren't using the political betting markets necessarily to bet on candidates, but they were hedging their other interests out there. So there's part of me that thinks, what if this move in the market that we're seeing right now is someone laying out hedges because they have business interests that could theoretically be harmed if Donald Trump becomes president? They have financial interests. Maybe they're a big investor in electric vehicles and hydrogen startup companies, right? This is a way to reduce potentially that risk if you were long a company like Plug, the EV company. Does that also ring a bell for you here when you look at how there's been this big divergence in the betting odds versus what the polls are saying?
That's such a good point, because that clearly is the ambition of all prediction markets as to how they hope to evolve as hedging markets. In fact, I remember looking at all the filings for FCMs that several firms have done to try to get the ability to host prediction markets on election outcomes. And they've always cited the necessity of having hedging platforms that could hedge political outcomes and use the futures markets as their reference. So in the same way that you use the futures markets to hedge orange juice production or pork bellies or whatever that financial future or commodity that you might be hedging, that's what the prediction markets hope to do. Now, the reality is they're predominantly populated by speculators and in the UK by punters right now, who are using them to wager in the same way people are gambling on sports. As these markets become more liquid and more robust and their technology scales, they will be viable hedging platforms, and that's certainly what these platforms are hoping for. At the same time, even though there's this kind of distortion we see between the current pricing on Kalshi that favors Trump and the reality of what is a much, 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 much tighter coin flip race, as evident by all the polling. So where are the opportunities? We mentioned one might be an arbitrage or a regression to the mean on the long Trump side. But I would point to there's a couple bets that I like right now that I'm active in. One of them we talked about on Predicted. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, and clearly it's moving we both agreed it was a layup, and that's will Biden resign. At that point, it was 87 cents. That's certainly going to close out as a no, 87 cents. It'll close out at $1. He's not resigning in 3 weeks remaining. He's going to complete his term, and you can still purchase the no's for, I think it's about 92 or 93 cents today, which is, still implies about a 7% return for over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. So that's not a bad bet. I think a little bit more enticing right now is, will the Republicans gain control of the Senate? A yes there is about 81 or 82 cents. Last I looked, I'm long that market. And I think it's almost a certainty when you look at the current polling and the way the states are turning. There's 23 held seats by the Democrats that are up for election. There's 11 GOP seats that are up for election. Now, one of those Republican held seats are in the danger of being lost, but the of the Democratic seats that are up for election. Some of them are
Certainly not.
toss-ups, and two of them, like Tester in Montana and the West Virginia seat, are clearly going to switch over to the Republican side. They're losing the Senate by 1 vote right now. They need 2. There's 5 in play for them, and it looks like a pretty certain outcome. So I think that's a really underpriced market right now. The probability of the Republicans taking control of the Senate, I think that's a nice market to look at right now.
The balance of power odds are shifting here. One thing that really, maybe I'm saying it's confusing. We talk about arbitrage opportunities across some of the markets and how in some places it's feasible, other places not, in part simply because of the liquidity available and the pricing that you're getting.
Yeah.
But you look at this right now, the second most likely scenario on the board after Republicans getting a clean sweep is Democratic president, Republican Senate, Democratic House. It almost feels like if Trump is going to win the presidency, Republicans are guaranteed to take the House. Right.
Say more about that. And I know this is something that you have a lot of insight on.
So when people split tickets, right, they typically split tickets upwards. So they vote locally in line with their political belief. And if they're going to cut their ticket, they're going to do it at the top. So that would mean that your typical Republican voter would go out there and vote Republican, state, local Congress, and then it gets to the presidency and say, I might vote for Harris here. In a world in which Donald Trump wins the presidency, it means that a lot of those people who may have been ticket splitters didn't split. And then there wasn't that reverse effect where there's down ballot drag, where people say, oh, this person is so affiliated with the party brand, I don't want anyone in the party there at all. Right. So if Trump is able to win, the down ballot bleed probably isn't as significant as people may think. And that means if you're thinking Trump is going to be the president, you're not only getting the Senate, which for the structural reasons you just mentioned, seems like a lock for the Republicans right now.
It does.
You also should be betting on the Republicans taking the House. And so realistically, the board that you're looking at is D Senate off the table. Any bet with D Senate, take it off the table.
Right.
You could have a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House. You get a Republican sweep. But it's very unlikely, right? Very unlikely that if Donald Trump wins, he's not going to be able to win the House back as well, because it means he didn't lose voters down ballot this time.
Well, it's not a bad payout at 45 cents right now. Actually, that seems a little high. Seems to be inflated right now as a result of this Trump surge. That's probably having a ripple effect everywhere. And to be clear about what we spoke to earlier, it's not really feasible to do arbitrage between PolyMarket and Kalshi because of the liquidity issue you mentioned.
Right.
It's a blockchain. It's just not going to happen unless you're a very active, 6-figure plus active trader on PolyMarket. You're not doing a lot of arbitrage between these markets. It's an interesting analysis. I currently am long the Republican president, Democratic House, Republican Senate. I bought that I'm the 22. I bought that at 17 cents, so I have a profit there. So it's trading at 22 right now, and I think your analysis is pretty compelling. I might just take that off the table.
Knowing those structural issues, the Democrat sweep here, you can still buy no for 87 cents.
That's right.
Making 13 cents over 87. That's also a pretty solid bet.
That's a fantastic bet. I agree with you completely. That 87 cents, that's as attractive as buying the Republican yes on the Senate.
Can I take a step back here? It feels like you and I are both in the same place. Your highest confidence bet for the balance of power is that the Republicans are going to take the Senate, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we're on the same page here.
Yes.
Anything that revolves around that axiom, that seems to be the favorable solution. Whatever mismatch you want to trade, as long as Republicans take the Senate, just the structure of this race this year, if Tester wins, it's going to be a miracle, right? Yeah. No one's beating Jim Justice, governor of West Virginia, now that Joe Manchin's on his way out the door after he admonishes the Democratic Party and changes his affiliation to independent.
Yeah,
okay?
and then I'd like to hear your take on it. You have Sherrod Brown in Ohio. That seems to be in play, and suddenly Tammy Baldwin's in play in Wisconsin.
They definitely seem to be in play, which is why part of me thinks it's not just the whale that's pushing around these Trump odds. One of the distinguishing features that we saw in recent months was the fact that people weren't happy with Biden, but they were willing to vote Democrat for the other seats. You saw this in Pennsylvania with Casey. You saw this in Michigan, Wisconsin. People were willing to say, no, I don't want Biden, but I'm going to support the Democrats up for their election. And when Harris comes out, Harris gives everyone a lift. There's a lot of enthusiasm for her. and the leads that these candidates had over their Republican opponents grows. All of a sudden in the past 3 weeks, the polling has shown that as Kamala's come back in, as Trump has gained in the polling overall, as the betting markets has shifted away from Harris and into the Donald, you're seeing that the Democrats polling in the swing states is also falling. And that's not what was happening over the summer months, not in August, not really in the first half of September either. So there is a coalescing right now in the betting where effectively people are imagining that whatever happens to Trump is going to filter through everywhere else. Because if Trump is able to get the turnout necessary to get over the hurdle to 270, it probably means he's awakening a large portion of his voting base that will then in turn vote those down ballot Republicans in order to give him the power that he wants to enact the legislative and executive outcomes he wants to achieve. So yes, the polling shift is meaningful. Republican Senate is the lock on the board in my eyes. Everything else still very much a coin flip, and the money line 125 to 150 hasn't moved all that much. So the value play here, Jeff, we've been on this train all year long. Well, all podcast history long between you and me. If either candidate gets to 60%, it seems like it's a fade.
That's right. Yeah. So far, that's been the case. That's worked out for us, right? If you can pull up a silver bulletin page, there's just to your point, right here. In fact, yeah, you've got the right spot. You can see the change from last week has all been red, except for something negligible in Minnesota, which is not really a swing state, anyways. All the polling advantage over the last week, the momentum seems to be on the red side. So that clearly. You're seeing that reflected in the markets right now. I also shared with you offline some insight that I'd like to share with our listeners. Yeah, and that was with respect to you and I both have some inside access, and there's somebody that used to run the social media team on the Obama's early campaign that is now a consultant that works for both parties, just not conflicting by working for both parties within one jurisdiction. But they're working a ground game in Pennsylvania for the GOP. And they told me a couple of days ago that the 600,000 vote advantage that was registered Democrats in that state has been cut to 300,000. It's been cut in half. And they also said there were 40,000 more absentee ballots requested by Republican voters in the state than there were the last election cycle. They also said specifically, and we mentioned Buck County previously, they said that they flipped Buck County red, which would be this is all anecdotal, but that would be material in the state of Pennsylvania because it's the Keystone County within the Keystone State. And flipping that would be a material advantage. So it looks like Pennsylvania, which we know is a pivotal state. Anecdotally, we're hearing some rumblings that are very favorable to the GOP, and that would have a big impact on the outcome. If the GOP, if Trump takes Pennsylvania, it's a dicey path for Harris to find the electoral votes to replace those 19.
We've seen the modeling. If Harris loses Pennsylvania, she has a 6% chance of winning the election, given the polling. So Pennsylvania, of course, is going to be a bellwether to watch on election night. However,
and the interesting thing about that is, let's go back. What is it? 4 years ago, last election, Pennsylvania took 4 days to certify their vote, right? And Pennsylvania still has a law in the books that does not allow absentee ballots to be counted until the morning of election day. So they've got all these ballots sitting right in front of them right now, but they can't count them. They can't open them. They can't touch them until the morning of election day. So
Florida opens them up as soon as you mail them in. You send your ballot in Florida, they open it up, they tabulate the vote. That's why Florida, despite having a bigger population than some of these other states, is able to get the results out in time. If you vote, your vote gets counted, and it only gets taken off the roll if you die prior to election day, which makes sense. Dead people shouldn't be voting, right, Jeff?
It's a good thing, right? Yeah. So Pennsylvania, I think on November 6th, we might still be talking about Pennsylvania.
November 6th, November 7th will be the first episode of the prediction trade after the election. Pennsylvania might not be done counting their votes by then.
Right.
The legitimate, serious topic. So we talked about the volatility surrounding the election and financial markets. How come it's not ending on November 7th between the election and the Fed meeting? Why is it lingering into the following week? Because of these structural issues and how the votes are actually tabulated and counted. But Jeff, this has been a really interesting shift. The only, to underscore the severity of how much the polling has shifted over the past week. There are 50 states in this great union. Only 5 have swung closer to the Democrats over the past week. They are California, Minnesota, Rhode Island, Washington, and Utah, none of which are considered important for this election. No offense to any of the people that live there. Jeff and I live in Illinois and New York, so our votes aren't really that important either on the national scale. But this has been a red wave in polling. Not to say that we're heading there in the election itself, but the polling has clearly shown a material shift. And all this polling, Jeff, to close out on this note, occurs prior to last night. Last night, Kamala Harris was in front of the Fox News audience for the first time, and Brett Baier. What was your impression of the interview? Do you think it moved the needle? And perhaps do you think today's betting market odd shift is directly related to last night's interview?
Well, I don't think it'd be related to last night's interview because that's too fresh. And, I'll leave that to the partisans to dissect her performance. I'm sure depending what tribal fire hose you're sucking on, you're going to get a different take on how that interview went for Harris. But I think the one insight that's been floated, so it's not unique, it's not my insight, being that Harris wouldn't have taken this interview if she didn't feel the need to because of internal polling. We've heard a lot lately about internal polling, with air quotes always, that the parties are looking at right now and that they're making decisions based off of that. And I think that lends some credibility to it. She knew she was going into rough territory. Brett, he's a decent newsman and seems to be about as down the middle as you're going to find on Fox or any network for that matter. But he's going to be tough because he's going to ask her questions that she hasn't heard elsewhere. And she knew that. She knew it was going to be tough and confrontational. And there's no way she would have taken that interview if she didn't see numbers, if her campaign wasn't seeing numbers that they didn't like. So as to whether or not that was a success for her, I'll leave that to other pundits. But I think they clearly are looking at numbers that they're reacting to, which is how she ended up on sitting across from Brett Baier.
It should be noted that the polls started to tighten between Trump and Harris after the Walz-Vance debate. There is a little bit of a shift there when you look at Nate Silver's polling averages. Jeff, I haven't seen the full interview just yet, but when people were asking me last night what I thought of it, I gave a similar response. I'm assuming that Democrats thought she did great. I'm assuming Republicans thought she was terrible.
Sure.
And I'm sure independents across America are shaking their heads saying, do we really have to vote for one of these two people?